Hey everybody, welcome back to the Readiness channel. Today we're going to pressure can some beef. I bought a couple of chuck roasts that were on sale at my local market that I've chopped up and cubed, ready to go. I've got all my jars, tools, and equipment cleaned out, laid out, ready to do this thing, so let's get started. So what I'm going to do right now is put this meat in the pot and cook it till rare. And what this is going to do is render out some of the liquid in this beef. I've got my beef kind of pre-cooked. It's still pretty rare on the inside. The broth that was left in the pot I'm going to use to finish off our liquid when we start jarring this stuff up. I've made myself a little checklist. Some of you that are old hands at canning might giggle at something like that, but there's a lot of steps to remember and a lot of important things that I don't want to forget. If you've ever pulled up to an intersection and stopped and tried to remember where the hell you were going, then you can understand how possible it is to get confused or forget something when you're doing something critical like this. I've added the beef to the jars, and now I'm starting to add that hot broth that we saved from cooking the meat down earlier. But here's an important step that we have to remember when we're canning. The USDA canning guide that I'm using tells us to leave 1 inch of headspace of product and liquid in the jar. The simple tool that I have here gives us all of the measurements we need for our head spaces, and they're clearly marked on the tool, maybe a little out of focus there, but this outer edge right here is 1 inch. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to measure 1 inch, and we're a little bit low, so I'm just going to add some more of the hot broth to the jar till we're brought up right to that 1 inch headspace. Additionally, the hot pack method that I'm using, the beef is submerged in the liquid, and that's exactly the way I want it. The raw pack method, by placing raw beef in the jar and not adding any liquid to it, may or may not have fluid covering all the meat. That's not a deal breaker for some people. I personally just don't want to eat products like that are sticking up above the fluid and turning funny colors and all that kind of stuff. So your mileage may vary on which process you want to use. I'm using what's called the hot pack method. I'm going to take a cloth with a little bit of white vinegar on it, and we're going to wipe this rim clean on the jar. It will cut any of the fat or meat juice that's dripped on that lid. And now we're going to place our lid on there and our band and just run it down finger tight, and that's it. All right, using the same tool that we used to measure our headspace, I just went around each jar and poked around, moved around the outside a little bit, and made sure that there was no trapped air bubbles between the pieces of meat, etc. I don't know that that's as much of a problem using this hot pack method as it might be with the cold pack, the raw pack, because in that case you've got pieces of raw meat that are pushed in there kind of tightly against each other, and I can see where air could be trapped easily in something like that. However, I'm not going to leave out any of the steps. I'm not a professional food processor or safety tester in any way, so I'm just going to follow the instructions provided in the USDA canning specifications, and that way we'll know that we've done everything that we can do to ensure safe end product. Okay, I'm going to look over my checklist here. We've pre-cooked our meat, we've filled the jars, we've got 1 inch of headspace, we've removed the air bubbles, we cleaned the jar seal, placed the lids on. Now we're going to stick them in the canner. We've got 3 quarts of hot water in here per the Presto specifications in the owner's manual. So now we're going to start placing our jars in the canner. All right, the next thing I want to do before I put the lid on is, if you notice here, we've got this vent pipe that comes out of the lid. It's important that we make sure that thing is clear. You can look down it by pointing it up at some light, make sure there's no obstruction, scale, rust, or any type of material from hard water that may be blocking that, and that's a real important step. Now we're going to go ahead and place the lid on this thing, and we're going to rotate it into its locked position. Now we're just going to wait for this thing to come up to some pressure until steam starts coming out of this open vent stack, and we'll talk about what we need to do there. Okay, it might be hard to see, but what we've done now is we've let the pressure come up into the canner enough where steam is coming out of that vent stack. And what we're told is when we see a steady stream of steam coming out of there, that once we've reached that point, we'll set the timer for 10 minutes and continue to let that vent. Yeah, our timer's been set, and I'm going to let that continue to vent for 10 minutes. Getting rid of that air that's built up in the canner and making sure that we're canning at the proper temperature is critical in this process. Okay, our pot is sufficiently vented. Now I'm going to talk about something real quick here. This canner with the gauge comes with the standard weight that would go over that vent stack, and then you would adjust the dial up to the temperature that's specified in the recipe, the safe canning specifications that you're following. I'm using now, instead of this, I'm using this weighted gauge, or sometimes called a jiggler. It has 3 different weights in one. Now in my elevation, which is under 1,000 feet above sea level, I'm told to use 10 pounds. And the way this weight works is this is supposedly 5 pounds. If I add one more washer to the stack, that's 10 pounds. And if we added the third component to it, that would be 15 if you were at a higher elevation. It's very critical that you know what elevation you're canning at and that you're following this precisely, otherwise you are going to be completely out of bounds on anything safe in processing this food. So 10 pounds is right for my elevation. This jiggler, I'm simply going to place it over that right now. And what I'm going to do is let that build up some pressure, and that will start rocking and making a specific sound that we'll talk about when we get to that point, and how you can know if you're at the right jiggle, as it were. Okay, now we just came up to pressure where our jiggler started moving, but now there's going to be a bit of an adjustment period where I'm going to need to back the heat down and maybe up a little bit and back and forth till I get it to hold and maintain exactly what I want it to do. Incidentally, even though we're not using the gauge in this process, since we're using the jiggler, as I just explained, it is interesting to me that it did start rocking right when the gauge reached 10 pounds, so that shows me that the gauge is still reading fairly accurate also. One of the reasons I went to this jiggler was simply because gauges need to be checked and tested on a regular basis to ensure that they're accurate. Quite frankly, I can't find anybody in my area that does it, and I've talked to a lot of other people that have told me the same thing. You can send the gauge back into Presto or whatever manufacturer you have for testing, but this weighted gauge jiggler setup just seemed to be a lot easier, and it seems to me that it has a lot of advantages. I'm going to provide a link down below for the Presto video. If you're using Presto equipment like I am, they made a video that shows you what that jiggle looks and sounds like, and I'll provide that link down below. Okay, once we get our pressure stabilized and we know that we're right where we want to be, we don't have to turn the heat up or down any further, and it's just maintaining right where we want it to be. It's at this point and this point only that we're going to start our timer for our process time in whatever recipe or guidelines that you're following. So how do I know what time I need to process this recipe and what other steps that I've taken in the video? Well, for me personally, I'm using this USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning. If you're one of these people that's using some old time-honored, story that's been passed down from generation to generation, that's playing Russian roulette that I'm not willing to play. So for me, using a tested standard like the recipes provided in this book I know that I'm doing the best practice for safe canning. I'm using the recipe right here about chunks of meat. I've done everything that it talked about there, and then right over here it gives me a chart with the process times in it. I'm using pint jars, and it's telling me process time at 75 minutes for either hot or raw pack. So that's what we're going to do. Now that the pressure canner is where it needs to be, pressure and or temperature wise, I can start that 75-minute timer from this point forward. Now let's say that I accidentally bumped the heat control on the stove while cleaning up or something while this is processing. Could I simply just turn the temperature back up, bring the pot up to the proper pressure, and just continue with the same time that I've been processing at? No. If something like that happens where the steady pressure / temperature has not been maintained during this processing time, then you need to bring the pot back up to the proper pressure and temperature, and then restart the timer completely from the beginning from that point forward. Okay, we just hit the time mark. Our 75 minutes for our pint jars of beef is done, and now I'm simply going to turn off the heat, and I'm just going to let this pot sit there and cool down and drop its pressure on its own. I'm not going to mess with anything, pull any vents off or otherwise. Timer from this point forward.